Welcome to The Happy Writer, a show about creating and sustaining a long-term author career. My name is Patty Jansen, writer of science fiction and fantasy. I've published independently since 2011. This show covers motivation, diversification, learning new skills, and your place in your career. Come on in and be happy. In episode 57 of The Happy Writer, I'm going to be talking about writing craft. Now, I will preface this by saying that I'm not an editor, but I have spent a lot of time, more than the average writer, in writing workshops. What happens in these workshops is that writers primarily critique each other's writing craft, because it is the most easy thing to critique. It doesn't require you to read an entire book. Over the years that I was in these groups, I have also developed some ideas about many of the writing rules, and I will talk about these. If you have ever taken part in a creative writing course or workshop, and to be honest, why not? If you haven't done this, you probably should, or at least read a book or two on the subject. You have probably come across some version of a list of forbidden words. Writers in the group, indeed sometimes even the tutors, treat these words as gospel. You're not allowed to use them, and any instance of them needs to be struck out. On this list, we will find words like that or something, or felt, saw, thought, heard, and similar words like that. Often tutors or participants also have an irrational hatred for the word was. Very rarely, however, does the course do a really good job of explaining why these words have such a bad name and why they recommend all instances be struck out. It's a very good idea to understand why you shouldn't rely too much on these words, and also why it is absolutely an extremely bad idea to strike out all instances of them. If a word or sentence structure exists in the English language, it means that there are times that you need it. Not only that, but there are times when using anything else would mean a contorted, hard-to-understand or longer sentence. Over the years that I have been in these workshops, I have distilled all the writing rules down to 3 writing commandments, and they are: don't confuse the reader, don't bore the reader, and don't annoy the reader. If you're writing genre fiction, non-fiction, indeed even much of literary fiction, your prose, the words you use to get across your message, is meant to be invisible. By that we mean that it is so natural to read that people don't notice that they're reading it, and they're focusing their attention on the things that you're trying to say instead. In other words, don't confuse the reader with word salad of a sentence of 80 words long when a much shorter, snappy sentence of 15 words will do. Do you really need all those words? They're confusing, they are potentially quite boring, or the reader starts to notice that you always use a particular sentence structure, in which case they start to annoy the reader. You want your words to get out of the way. Anyone who writes fiction that could remotely be called literary will probably now jump up and say this doesn't apply to literary fiction, and I would say it applies maybe a little bit less. But if you took a work of literary fiction that is very popular and looked at the sentences, you'll probably see that the same principle applies. Literary fiction is not exempt from the 3 rules of writing. It is that it more strongly attributes secondary meanings to common words. It is not necessarily full of long words and bombastic language, because seriously, that's as boring as batshit. So, I will now go through a number of these bad words one by one and describe how you can and cannot get rid of them. One of the greatest offenders is the word that. People in creative workshops will tell you that you never need it, and technically they might even be right. But, and there is a big but, the word that is one of the most common words in the English language, and our brains have become used to hearing it. While there are many sentences where you could easily strike out the word, and the sentence would mean just the same, it is that, when reading, Our brains expect it to be there, and the reader will want to stop and figure out why the sentence sounds strange. See what I did there? Instead of, it is that when reading, I could say, it is when reading. But I'd need a comma and the sentence wouldn't flow as well. So, don't go overboard. One of the most common stories of people trying to get a traditional deal and having gone through a lot of writing workshops is that once the work was acquired and got to the editors put half the that back in where they had originally been. For a self-published writer, I advocate a program like Pro Writing Aid, which will have all these rules that I'm talking about embedded in it. It's not always terribly good about explaining why, but if the program flags that you're overusing the word that, you should probably get rid of at least the most low-hanging fruit, where the sentence truly does not need it. This should not require you to reword too many sentences, unless you rely too much on meaningless structures like that was what it was. A good editor and Pro Writing Aid should also flag this. Again, don't get rid of all instances of the word that. A word or phrase exists in the language, so sometimes there is a need for it. But you need to absolutely avoid sounding too repetitive in your word choices. That falls under don't bore the reader and don't annoy the reader. When the reader starts to notice a certain pattern in your word choice, they will start to look out for the word that, and they will no longer be engaged by your story. Very few readers will write this in their review, because they're not writing teachers, but they will notice the patterns, and they are distracted. The same applies to the word was. I can tell you, because I've seen it, that there is only one thing worse than a manuscript that has 2 instances of the word was in every sentence, and that is one in which it is not used at all. In my writing workshop days, I have met people who were going through a stage that they genuinely believed that their work would be publishable, only if they struck out every instance of the word was. No, that's just ridiculous. But that is not to say that you shouldn't try it on a piece of your text to see how you can play around with language, and you might even discover a more interesting sentence structure that is shorter and more to the point. The same applies for passive language, which is when you're saying something was done and the subject that's doing the thing is not mentioned. Don't confuse passive language with the word was, by the way. If your sentence reads, something was done about it, that may be exactly what you intended to say. Such a sentence structure would believe me to think that a large government body was doing the thing, and the characters had no influence on it, or alternatively, it wasn't important enough to be more specific. You could, of course, reword the sentence, but it would require you to name people and be specific. It would change the feel and importance of the event. Again, you sometimes need passive sentence structure, because if it is more important that you say that the character was released from prison, it doesn't really matter who released him, because that is not the focus of your story. I will make special notice of past or present continuous tense, which is the sentence structure with is or was and then a continuous form of the verb, like so. If something or someone was doing something. Of course, this is a valid structure, but it is one that is often overused by writers. It leads to the dreaded overuse of the word was, and very often it's not actually necessary that a character was doing something. That only matters if you're going to describe something else that happened at the same time. Could you say that the character did a thing? If the answer is yes, then do so. Which brings me to the word something, which I have noticed I have rather been using a lot in this podcast. The word something, by its very nature, is vague. Fiction and vague are enemies. If you say that something hit the character in the face, this is going to be a rather nondescript statement. What is this kind of something? Was it wet? Was it hard? Was it soft? Was it perhaps stringy and sticky like a spider web? This falls under don't bore the reader. Something hit him in the face is a boring sentence that is rather useless by itself. Describe the feeling, because the character is walking or sitting somewhere, and if suddenly the roof starts leaking and water runs down his face, that's going to evoke a very different reaction in the reader than if the character was walking through a dark house and ran into a spiderweb. So the other day I was on a walk and I got hit on the top of my head by something. I couldn't see what it was because it was the top of my head, but I can still feel the very sharpness on my skin right through my hair, and it is that feeling that kind of evokes the same type of emotion in the reader. The word something doesn't do any of that. If you're interested, it was a bird that landed on my head and attempted to pull out some of my hair for its nest. Now we get to the so-called filler words. He heard, she thought, he felt, she saw, words like that. These are what creative writing calls filler language, and in most cases they are just ballast in your sentence. If you are rightly in the point of view of your character, and I might do another episode on point of view, then you truly don't need these words, especially when you're describing an event that happened. So going with a character that snuck into an abandoned house, you can just describe the things that your character experienced. You don't need to say he heard a creak on the stairs. You can just say the stairs creaked. You don't need to say he felt there was no one in the house or he felt a presence of something evil. You can describe how the house gave the impression that it was abandoned, through open doors and flapping windows and rubbish on the floor. Yes, this will use more words, but it's much more evocative. In case of feeling the evil presence, that is assuming the character has some knowledge that the reader doesn't. Either describe the presence or simply delete the prescient feeling and trust that the reader will get it. They will. After all, there are so many movies that show a character walking alone through an abandoned house. And isn't there a little voice somewhere in the movie that says that she felt an evil presence? Because that will be implied in the situation. There is no need to say it. Readers are not stupid. They will get it. If you've done your job and described the situation well enough, they don't need to be told what the character feels or hears or sees unless, and here we come to the exception, unless the feeling, hearing, and seeing is the most important verb in the sentence. If you say a door clanged, it presumed that the character knows the house in question and knows what a door sounds like. If the character is in an unknown situation and is trying to make sense of it, the filter words are useful because you can say she thought it was a door, but it was clear to the reader that the character wasn't sure. You can also say it sounded like a door, but on the other hand, you may have used the phrase it sounded a few times already in the scene. That'd be boring. So again, I recommend that you go through a creative writing workshop at least once and get hit in the face with all this forbidden language and rules. Then try to figure out what it means in terms of don't bore the reader, don't confuse the reader, and don't annoy the reader. Every writing rule has a point and a reason. If you're overusing a particular sentence structure, your writing will probably be better if you get rid of half of them. We want our writing to be easy to read, not repetitive and not boring. Writing that is cluttered with words you don't need to is hard to wade through, and that becomes boring and annoying very quickly. You can tell by looking at someone's look inside whether they have just slapped up the first book with minimal editing or whether they have worked on their craft for a while. Funnily enough, the people who assume they can write because they have done it in their previous profession often are the worst. The academics, the high-level public servants, will have written many millions of words in their careers, and their writing is as dry as a 50-year-old bone. They write in long, convoluted, clever sentences where someone grabbing a book for relaxation gives up after the first paragraph. The reader might struggle to say why, but they will just say, "No, I wasn't into it." Rest assured, I'm not trying to be snarky here. I was trained as an academic, and I know exactly the sort of language that people professionally get taught to write. It is horrible. Writing fiction that is easy to read is actually pretty hard, and the craft of writing gets next to no acknowledgement in the self-published writer world. People like to pretend it's all about marketing. If your book doesn't sell, you need to throw more marketing at it. It may sell well a little bit, but if you have genuine trouble selling the second book in the series, even after major promotions, it means that most of the readers who bought book 1 aren't getting to the end of it, so they can move on to the next book. Writing an engaging book that people just rip through is not a matter of dumbing down. It is a whole different level of writing altogether, and it is one that comes naturally to very few people. So here you go. Those were my thoughts on the forbidden words. You can find lists of these words, but I really would work with an editor who knows this stuff. And even before that, I would just get Pro Writing Aid, which points all this out to you. And I would also read some books about this stuff and maybe take part in a workshop or two. Just don't take it to extremes. In the next episode, I will talk about the mindset to survive in this career. Thank you for listening to the Happy Writer Show. Check out links and information about other episodes on my website at pattyjansen.com, where you can also find out about my books. You can support me by subscribing to the show or on Patreon at patreon.com/pattyjansen.